All right. All right. Is your camera on? Everybody ready? Can everybody hear me okay? Can everyone hear me okay with my mask? See, the acoustics are great in here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to enjoy this incredible show in person. We are so glad that we can host John and his family and close friends. The community has really been attending your show throughout the exhibition, and so I'm glad that they got to see it. I wish they were here tonight as well, but we're still glad to be able to host this during COVID, and it's just been a blessing to be surrounded by such inspirational work this past couple months. So thank you for sharing this with our community. I'm going to turn over the floor to John here in just a quick sec, but I do want to say a quick thank you to some of our sponsors and volunteers that helped make the show and the reception tonight possible. We'd like to thank the exhibit sponsors. So we had 3 businesses that helped sponsor the costs of producing the show: Peachy Insurance, Bolin Office Supply, and New York Life, C.L. Miggs and Associates. Thank you. We really appreciate your sponsorships and making this art possible. Thank you. We appreciate you. And also just a big thanks to our board of directors and our volunteers and board members that worked on putting the awesome decor together tonight. Betty Chin and Susan Miggs did the decor this evening. Betty makes all those gorgeous pumpkins out there. They're super creative, and I think you worked with one of your granddaughters too, and her whole family is just super creative. We love how, the decor and everything at the environment is just artistic, just like the show. I mean, it's just fun to have that. So we thank you for providing that. And yeah, thank you very much. And thank you as well to your committee members. Suzanne Patton and Diane Ladenberger also helped to compile those awesome gift bags. Several local stores around town. Please enjoy those gift bags tonight when you leave. Take one of those. They're fantastic. Quint Liquor also sponsored those. Memories has some fun candles in there too. So we've just got a great fun collage for you to take home. And again, thank you for your donations and supporting our artists here and making it all possible. Without further ado, we'll get over to the main event and have you talk about your work. And if you'll cover a little bit more about your background, I think that'd be just awesome. Thank you again, John.
Yeah,
We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Stan, does that work for sound? Okay. So first off, I want to thank Brittany and I want to thank Stan especially for initially inviting me for this exhibition and creating this opportunity and an opportunity to share my work with the community that essentially raised me is pretty special, and to do it in such an amazing space. It really is a credit to the community and the citizens of Pratt to have a venue like this for art to be shown. As I was sharing with some of you outside, there's a lot of communities throughout the country, much larger than Pratt, that don't have anything like this. So it's really a special place, and I hope that the citizens certainly take advantage of it as much as possible. So as far as myself, I was raised about 7 miles northwest of here on the Swindler family farm, and learned a lot of what you see in here is in some ways started in that space and was formed through those experiences. My formal training began at Fort Hays State University, where I studied studio arts and concentrated in printmaking, and then I went on to receive an MFA from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. And then got my first college teaching gig at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, and then 2008 joined the faculty of Lamar Dodd School University at the University of Georgia. Lamar Dodd School of Art, at the University of Georgia. They provide this. This is a little branding for them, evidently, unintentional, but maybe I'll get paid for it. So I've been at Lamar Dodd for the past 14 years. I'm going on now, I suppose. So it's it's been a pretty interesting ride from here to there. And so again, it kind of felt very nice to come back here and show what is really, represents the most recent work that I've been making. So that's kind of a little biography. And so I think Stan wanted me to kind of talk about the work and travel through the space a little bit, and then also answer any questions that you all might have.
Ask questions anytime.
But at the same time, I can also sort of turn to some of these works or these bodies of work and sort of talk about those a little bit, if that's helpful. Okay, well, we can start right here if you want. So this is, as most of the work that's in here, all of the work that's in here are collages that incorporate a variety of materials. My formal training, so to speak, in studio art was in printmaking, and that is primarily what I teach at UGA. But these works are by no means traditional prints. In fact, there's a beautiful Berger Sanzane on the opposite wall that's a stone lithograph. So that's really what I started doing. There are elements of those mediums and those processes in these works, in addition to woodcut, lithography, of photoplate, well, I don't want to get too technical, intaglio or etching, monotype. So there's all of these techniques that I both teach and that I employ in my own practice, and including digital printmaking processes and using laser cutters to create plates from which to print. So I combine those printed elements oftentimes with found materials, and these are materials that might be detritus that are remnants from the studio in which I work, and so personal studio, but then also the studio that I work and teach in at the school. Art produces a lot of kind of like bits of leftover material, and having spent the last 20 years of my life in art departments, art schools, I've always kind of paid attention to those elements and found sometimes the stuff that sort of like falls off during the process of making a work is sometimes more interesting than the work itself. And so that has kind of informed how these works that developed, and that might actually clarify them in some way for you. They might feel in many ways like a weird sort of mashup or conglomeration of mark and image and material, because that's exactly what they are. And so in making these, I'm not only trying to challenge the viewer, that is my audience, I'm also challenging myself. And so I'm trying to create some kind of visual experience that can provide some kind of visual novelty or surprise to myself. And I feel like if I can surprise myself, then I have a pretty good chance of surprising the viewer in some way. And sometimes that surprise is, the reaction is, I don't like that, and that's fine. Like the point of art is not necessarily to create a pleasurable experience. I feel like the point of art is to create an experience that requires one to ruminate and to think and to question and to consider. We're not necessarily offering something that is purely beautiful. And so, now, I like the work that I make. It would be weird if I didn't. It's very easy for artists to sort of be very self-critical, which, trust me, I am. But at the same time, when I'm finished, I want to like the thing that I've made, and so that's very important. So yeah, I walk into this room, it gives me pleasure. And I also try to create kind of a when I'm in the studio, I'm trying not to control every little piece and part. In fact, I try to introduce as much kind of chance into the way that I make as possible, so that we'll create some kind of a visual consequence that I wasn't expecting. And so for me, that's really interesting. And in fact, I oftentimes go back to I think about my experience growing up on the farm, and my father and grandfather having these piles of raw materials around, wood and metal and hardware, some of it organized, some of it not, but those always being a resource for them to cull from which to repair something practically, or to invent something. There was always inventing happening on a farm, and that's oftentimes what we as artists do, is we're constantly inventing. We're creating our own tools from which to create some kind of experience, oftentimes visual, that is sort of unexpected or uncanny. And so that experience on the farm and witnessing that sort of like like that very kind of intuitive and kind of responsive way of like solving problems as they arose, not hiring everything out necessarily. It's like, okay, well this solution requires a new thing that doesn't exist, so let's figure out a way to make that thing exist. And so that way of kind of problem solving that I witnessed there in a more knuckle-busting manner definitely has crept into the way that I work and the way that I think about making work. And so what you see in here is very much kind of a manifestation of that. And so in this work over here, over my left shoulder, is a collaboration with a very good friend of mine, Sarah Hess. And she and I have been working together for about the past year. And the way that most of my collaborations work, and I have a collaboration on the back wall with a friend of mine by the name of Mike McFalls, who's a colleague, teaches at another university in Georgia. And then some pieces back here that are collaboration with my 9-year-old daughter who has scampered away. So in all of these collaborations, and I guess the reason I'm interested in collaborating is because, as I mentioned before, sort of like using the inanimate materials of art to create some kind of like visual experience that's unexpected. When you're working with another mind, it just amplifies that because they're working with the materials in a completely different way that challenges what you would naturally do. And so I enjoy that sort of the rub that is created there, or sometimes the tension that's created there, because my collaborator may do something, and that happens all the time, that I am perplexed by or frustrated by, and that experience is one of growth, because anytime you're learning, it's uncomfortable. You know, that's why kids hate school half the time. Not always, but learning is hard, you know, and learning oftentimes comes from discomfort. And so in my teaching and in my own practice, I try to kind of create circumstances which create discomfort so that more learning can occur. So I'm always wanting to learn from my own sort of like choices in the studio. And one of the ways I've done that is by introducing others into that space, other artists, other minds, a 9-year-old, for example, you know, and seeing what kind of what can come out of that collaboration. So this work is in many ways very similar to the rest of this. So I mean, I could sit here and talk probably at length about all of this work, but I will try not to do that. This one though is, you know, each of those collaborations to me feels quite different because of the influence of the other person in this work, the materials that they introduce, the decisions they make. And those decisions, in these, for example, there's a lot of materials in here that I would not have normally used, but Sarah introduced them. And so, and there's times where in that space I want to take my stuff and run away like a kid with a toy. But the hard thing to do is say, okay, what can I do in response to this? And that, of course, that experience exists for the other person. So it's very much a reciprocal thing. But I think in the end, what comes out of it is, again, something that's much, much stronger than what I would necessarily do by myself. Or at the very least, something that's, again, unexpected or novel in some way. And so these were made in a period of a few weeks that was working within the kind of a finite, like 12 by 12 size. I happened to have a number of frames that were remaining from another piece. I try to repurpose as much as possible. And in many ways, what you see in this work are the remnants or the vestiges of other works that were failures, or maybe they were successes and I just got tired of them and I folded them back into this so that everything kind of gets piled back into this thing. Because thinking about the farm analogy again, like all of the piles of wood and metal and materials, those were all something else at one point. They're just sort of existing in a different state when they're in a pile, whether that wood is from an old barn or the metal is from a piece of equipment. It's just sort of in a different state. So I feel like this work, unless somebody says I want to own this and hang this in my house, or an institution says that, it will continue to sort of live. And I try not to anymore like think of any of this stuff as finished. It's all here to be used and to be kind of like as a resource. So it kind of exists as both. The way that you're experiencing this work now is how it exists today in the context of this exhibition, but in a year from now, a lot of this stuff could have and will very well have changed in some way. And so I enjoy that idea of it kind of continuing to evolve and continuing to change. I'm talking a lot, but I'm a teacher. I get paid to do this, so I know how to do this. I'm more than happy to answer any like specific questions that any of you might have.
What's the base material of these?
So those are printed on. Most of these have foundationally paper, right? And so these have a heavyweight rag paper, a cotton-based paper that I basically printed some initial layers onto. And these were actually begun at the University of Tennessee. I did a visiting artist gig up there and began those foundational layers up there. And then all of these little chunks that are sort of floating on top of those are actually separate pieces of paper that have been collaged onto those, and just using tape then, archival tape, to kind of define that edge to give them a little bit of volume. But it's basically paper on top of paper with a little bit of tape. But I really enjoy the process of printing and building the layers. You know, it's basically using a press as a paintbrush in a sense, but it happens a lot faster.
You know, they're flat, but they look very three-dimensional.
Yeah, I think back to my early art education. I think back to my very first drawing class with actually Professor Michael Yilk, and I saw you had a little painting of his hanging around the corner. And I think back to the lessons that I learned in that class, and just very basic, formal, formal elements of drawing and design and art. And I think about those lessons still as I'm working through a picture. The relationship of positive and negative space is one that continually sort of fascinates me. And so these pieces in many ways are very much about that relationship and sort of activating the foundation, that base layer, and then building on top of that, and really trying to create as much activity as possible while still trying to create some kind of illusory space between those things that are floating above and that foundational layer below.
John, can you, when we were hanging the 12 by 12s, I was fascinated by the detail of some of them. Can you describe the process you go through? Like, for example, you just start putting stuff on there and then add color, or are you adding color and stuff as you go?
So these are made in my, so I moved into a new house a few months ago, and that house came with a cute little studio, and so these are really the first works that came out of that. And so there was actually a lot of this is actually some of these are consist of previous versions of these, and so there's some of those that are kind of floating within. So the color was already in there because there were remnants from these other collages within there. And then we subsequently began just adding materials, and then because I didn't have access to the school at that point, because the studios were closed down due to the pandemic, I couldn't go in there and print. So I was basically using kind of at-home techniques that I had access to, and one of which is using spray paint and stencils. And so a lot of that color, the additional sort of bright, more vibrant color, actually comes from spray paint. Within those, it's like an easy kind of at-home solution, but a lot of this is just stuff that I've accumulated. Again, kind of going back to that idea of piles. I literally have piles of materials and boxes of materials that, in fact, one of the things I wasn't able to do because I wasn't able to come on site for the actual installation is I was going to do kind of a site-specific installation here with materials that I had collected from the old farm, and then other kind of rural abandoned sites which I just find those beautiful. In fact, I was with my good friend Sean Fields today. We were driving through Coates, and there's this old like little garden that's made from petrified trees, and I just, those things are amazing, and it is kind of heartbreaking in a way to see the decay in those spaces, but there's also something very beautiful about it as well. And so, I mean, again, I think back to those experiences, and that has imbued a lot of this work with the sort of like surface quality and the color and the richness that you see. I don't know if that answered your question per se, but yeah. Yeah, sure, we can go over here. And I can speed up a little bit as well. And again, thank you all for coming out. I know tonight was a diminished reception due to increasing numbers of COVID, but thank you all for coming out. And I know wearing the mask is no fun, but I'm used to smelling my own breath because I have to teach in one of these. So I chew a lot of gum. So these are all of the work is pretty recent that you see in here. I think those are the oldest pieces back there, which I'll get to. So this was kind of a fun one I was doing last winter, early spring, in which I created this one first, and then all of the byproducts of this collage created this one. So they're very much, even though they look very different, they're the kind of like the pieces that came out of this, the negative shapes, I used to create this piece over here. So it's kind of very much kind of a call and response. And it wasn't intentional. I had an idea for this work in particular, and using some more recent printed elements, and honestly was looking for a different strategy because I'd been working on these so much and everything was so flat. I wanted to give these a little bit more depth, and that's why they're floating above it. I just wanted to see how that would function within the frame, and then of course the remnants, once again, the sort of leftover stuff to me was still quite interesting, so I used that to make those pieces there. So, and around the same time, and we can kind of transition here, I was wanting to do something a bit more traditional and painterly, I suppose. So I built these 6, not canvases necessarily, but these panels, and began and wanted to do something again that was more like a painting, I suppose. And so I collaged a bunch of these printed remnants onto these very loosely. And then I shortly thereafter had some people in my studio, and they said, leave them alone, they don't need anything else. And that happens oftentimes. And I felt, as an artist, sometimes you feel like it should be really hard, right? Like I made those relatively quick, and it felt like I hadn't put enough effort into them. But I also trusted the instincts of my colleagues who gave me that feedback, and so I pretty much left them alone. I went back in and did some refinement and gave them some gloss because I wanted them to feel a little bit more painterly, I suppose. But these panels over here, I went ahead and executed to basically the fullest extent that I was thinking about this whole series. And so these are the ones that I actually collaborated with my daughter on. And so I was working on these and was a little frustrated by them. And so my daughter, I use a lot of tape in my work. I find tape to be like a really easy line. It's really quick, and you can get any color, and it's archival. It's an archival material. And she had been just making these little collages as a 9-year-old does with various materials. And I said, "Can you make some more of those?" And she said, "Sure." And she said, "What do you want me to make?" I said, "I don't care, just make whatever. Like, I just do whatever you want to do." And so I took those and then began collaging. So all these little stripes and kind of striations in here, those are from her, and from her kind of just 9-year-old activity. And so those are really kind of what finished these up for me. And I laid down some subsequent layers of paint and other materials onto these, but it was really her kind of effort that sort of like finished those in many ways, which again, just having another mind in the room and having somebody else in this space to sort of interact with, for me, it does, I mean, obviously working with a 9-year-old can be challenging, but she was really excited about coming and seeing these and seeing her name on the on the title card. I'm like, we've already started your resume. You know, you're on your way. So, do we want to swing around or do? I'll talk quickly, and then you all can take your seats back. So these are probably the oldest that are in here. So these are from a collaboration with a friend of mine, Mike McFalls. Mike teaches at Columbus State University, which is in West Georgia, just on the border with Alabama. And he's a great artist, and he and I have been collaborating for a number of years in a number of different locations. I made these we made these together. I guess I assembled them. We were talking about this on the way. We were talking about how all car brands are kind of global now on the way in. And, you know, I drive a Subaru that was assembled in Indiana. And so I assembled these, but the parts came from, you know, like various places that Mike and I had collaborated in Sweden and in Idaho and various places. And so I just kind of brought all of these elements together in these collages because our collaborations tend to be these large sculptural installations that are pretty massive. So we wanted to create something that was small and discreet, and so that's where these came from. So these are a little bit different in that there's actual plywood in these, because oftentimes the things that Mike and I make are very large, and so I wanted to just take, again, these are again more remnants from those larger installations and sculptural works, and placing them within these kind of small refined spaces and seeing how they function together. But in these there's actually a lot of digital imagery. So those digital images that you see in there that are quite abstract are actually from documentation of some of our other projects. And so we'll take photographs of those and then put those kind of back into these pieces as well. And I'm a big fan of doing that. I like using all manner of media as a way to kind of like reference other media. To me, that's pretty fun, because I think it speaks a lot about information and the way that we access visual information, and the way that information changes just depending on how you view it, right? If you view something on a screen, it's a very different experience than viewing something on a piece of paper, right? And so I think that's an important conversation to be had for sure. We don't have to have it today. And I'll finish and I'll talk about these guys on this wall.
Do you teach graduate students or beginning students?
I teach all levels. Yeah, I teach everybody from first semester freshmen to graduate students working on their MFA, which in my field is our terminal degree. And everything in between. So these are, I talked about them a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, I printed these initial layers during a visiting artist gig, and then brought them back to my studio to kind of finish them. And they were, in a lot of ways, a bit of a departure from what I'd been doing previously. It's a little hard to talk about work that's not here, so I don't want to do too much of that, because a lot of the collage work I had done prior was much more refined. It felt much more kind of like designed and intentional, and I was really trying to create something that was a bit more disjointed and visually dysfunctional in a way. And I already did reference a little bit kind of talking about that space and trying to create kind of two different planes existing simultaneously on these. And I like the simple gesture of just adding the tape to the edge of those other pieces as a way to create an illusion of depth or an illusion of volume. I always tell my students, you know, like I like really dumb things. Like I like things that are simple, but then have the potential to be extremely complex or extremely poetic, but all it took is one little sort of like move or one little shift of an object, a material, whatever that happens to be. You know, I think that's a lot of my favorite artists do that very effectively. And it really just comes from experience working with materials and experience existing as a human being and paying attention to the world around them, especially the visual world. And so, as I mentioned, and this is a great place to end, is, thinking about my own relationship to the work and wanting to create work that ultimately that I do enjoy and that does challenge me. As somebody that tries to pay attention as much as possible and tries to be critical of the world, or at least visual information that we're fed, I want this work to be. For a moment, I thought it sounded like a tornado siren. That would have been. But I'm looking for. I'm really looking to create some kind of a different experience for the viewer outside of that. Because we ingest so much information, especially now, it's an election cycle, and there's just so much that we're being battered with visually every day. It can be really difficult to kind of parse that out, because it is, I think, in many ways kind of meant to confuse. And so there's confusion here, but at the same time, I think that one of the differences between art and a visual art of this nature is it's meant to be enjoyed and absorbed over a long period of time. It's not something that you just you can completely take in a 5-minute viewing, and unfortunately that's about the average attention span for most of us these days. So it is nice to live with art, to have something that's on your walls that you sort of have to negotiate every single day, or negotiate with in some way. I think that's a really important experience because I walk around with my phone in my pocket and my face in it way too much. It is important to go home and have that work surrounding me and have something that's a very different experience. No less challenging, but it's an other experience.
Aren't you associated with the art museum at your university?
What's that?
Are you associated with the art museum?
Personally, or as an? I've worked with them. I don't necessarily show over there. So the Georgia Museum of Art, which is our state museum, is literally right next to where I teach, and it's a great institution. And I've worked with them in different capacities, but mainly they historically hosted our MFA thesis exhibition. So it's usually helping our graduate students get their work ready for that show. So, but. It's a big space. Well, does anybody else have any questions or? Well, I appreciate you tolerating my talking at you for this long. Again, thanks for coming, and thanks again to Brittany and Stan especially, and all of the other board members and everybody that has invested in this space. It's very much appreciated. So thank you.